I had just gotten back to our townhouse in Raleigh after 5 exhausting, but career-defining days in Denver, where I had represented Blue Peak Solutions at a corporate summit packed with executives who measured your worth in numbers and confidence. And by the time I boarded my return flight, I had secured 2 contracts worth over $620,000 for the firm and received an unofficial but very clear indication from my VP that I was next in line for the senior regional director promotion, which meant a significant salary increase, stock options, and, finally, the kind of professional validation I had been grinding toward for nearly a decade. I walked through a front door, still riding that quiet high, already imagining popping open the bottle of bourbon I had brought back from Denver, telling Lauren every detail about the negotiations, the late-night strategy sessions, the moment the final signatures went through, expecting her to be proud of me, to maybe wrap her arms around my neck and say she knew I would pull it off. Instead, I found her sitting at the dining table like she was about to deliver a board presentation. Her laptop was open in front of her, a neat stack of handwritten notes aligned perfectly to the right, her posture rigid, her makeup flawless in a way that did not look casual or spontaneous, but deliberate, almost strategic. The house was silent, no music playing, no dinner cooking, no sign that she had been counting down the minutes until I got home. I set my suitcase down slowly, the wheels making a dull sound against the hardwood floor, and before I could even take off my jacket, she told me to sit down, because we needed to talk, and she wanted my full attention. I remember thinking she was joking at first because the tone was so formal it felt surreal, but her eyes were steady and serious, and she said that while I had been away, she had spent a lot of time reflecting on our relationship and on what she wanted for her future, and she had come to the conclusion that I was at a crossroads. She said I had exactly 7 days to prove that I was worthy of staying in her life. 7 days. She said it calmly, as if she were outlining performance metrics for a probation period. She explained that I needed to demonstrate that I could prioritize her over my career, that I needed to show tangible actions, not promises, that I was ready to become the man she envisioned for her future, a man who would choose partnership over ambition, presence over promotion, emotional availability over constant travel and late-night conference calls. I stood there in my own living room feeling like I had just walked into the wrong house. I had spent the past week negotiating 6-figure deals that would directly impact the company's growth trajectory, operating on 4 hours of sleep a night, pushing myself to the edge because I believed that building a stable, financially secure future was part of being a responsible partner. And now I was being told that the very effort I thought was strengthening our foundation was evidence that I was failing her. She said she did not want to compete with my job, that she refused to be second place to quarterly targets and expansion plans, that if I truly loved her, I would be willing to step back, decline the promotion if necessary, restructure my priorities in a way that centered her needs first. There was no yelling, no dramatic gestures, just a calm, controlled delivery that made it feel even colder. She had bullet points. She had examples of times I had missed dinners because of client calls, weekends I'd spent traveling, moments where she felt I was physically present but mentally calculating logistics in my head. She framed it as an opportunity for me to prove growth, to prove maturity, to prove that I understood what partnership meant. But all I could hear was that my life's work, the ambition that had driven me since college, the discipline and sacrifices I had made, were now being measured against a 7-day deadline like I was on trial for wanting to succeed. Instead of arguing with her or asking what specific hoops she expected me to jump through to satisfy this sudden evaluation period, I felt something inside me go very still, almost detached, like the part of me that negotiates contracts had stepped in and decided this was no longer an emotional exchange, but a matter of principle. And without raising my voice or interrupting her carefully structured speech, I reached down, picked up my suitcase that I had not even fully set aside yet, and told her she would not need all 7 days because the answer she was looking for had already been lived out over the last 3.5 years. I reminded her that in Charlotte we had built routines together, that we had shared grocery lists, Saturday morning coffee rituals, Sunday evening meal prep, spontaneous midweek takeout when deadlines crushed us both, that we had taken vacations we planned months in advance and sat side by side on planes mapping out the kind of life we wanted to create, that we had opened a shared savings account with the explicit intention of building a future, that I had supported her when she switched jobs and doubted herself, that I had shown up to her networking events even when I was exhausted, that I had listened to her rehearse presentations the same way she once claimed she admired how driven I was. I told her calmly that if 3.5 years of consistency, loyalty, financial responsibility, emotional support, and shared vision had not proven my value to her, then a forced audition week where I scrambled to manufacture symbolic gestures would not magically shift her perception. I explained that love is not validated through time trials. And that partnership is not demonstrated by abandoning one's ambition on command just to meet a narrative someone else has drafted. My voice did not shake, and I did not plead, because somewhere in that moment I realized that what she was asking for was not reassurance, but submission to a framework where my worth could be periodically reassessed, depending on how well I performed according to her evolving standards. When she saw me standing there with my suitcase in hand, something in her composure cracked, and the confidence that had framed her earlier presentation gave way to panic. She stood up quickly, the chair scraping against the floor, and said that I was supposed to fight for us, that I was supposed to ask for guidelines, to demand clarity, to prove that I cared enough to meet her expectations, that this was my opportunity to show how serious I was about her future. Her voice rose slightly, no longer measured and professional, but edged with frustration, as if I had failed to follow the script she had imagined where I would scramble to negotiate terms for my continued presence in her life. I looked at her and told her that I do not compete for the role of my own girlfriend's partner, that I will not audition for a position in a relationship I have already invested years of loyalty into, and that if she truly believed my commitment required a 7-day performance plan, then we were not operating from the same understanding of what a relationship is supposed to be. I told her that relationships are partnerships, not performance reviews, that there are no quarterly evaluations where one person sits behind a table with notes and metrics while the other stands waiting to be judged worthy. I said that I had never asked her to prove herself to me, never put her on a timeline to demonstrate she deserved to stay, never framed our connection as something contingent on her ability to rearrange her identity to suit my ambitions. The more she insisted that I was misinterpreting her intentions, the clearer it became to me that this was about control disguised as clarity. She wanted reassurance in the form of sacrifice, proof in the form of compliance. I told her that I was proud of the man I was becoming, proud of the discipline it took to secure those contracts, proud of the trajectory I had built with relentless effort, and that any partner standing beside me should see that ambition as part of the package, not a flaw to be corrected. I did not slam the door. I did not shout. I simply walked toward it with my suitcase, understanding with a strange calm certainty that I would rather walk away with my integrity intact than stay and negotiate my own worth on a 7-day deadline. The next morning, I did not deviate from my routine by a single minute because I refused to let emotional turbulence dictate the structure of my day. So my alarm went off at 5:30 a.m. I was on the sidewalk by 5:45 for my usual 4-mile run through the quiet streets of Raleigh. The air still cool and thin, my mind steady in a way it had not been the night before. And when I finished, I drove straight to Iron Forge Fitness, where I moved through my standard push session without rushing a single rep, bench pressing with controlled tempo, focusing on breathing and discipline, reminding myself that consistency is not loud or reactive, it is deliberate and calm. After the gym, I went home, showered, made my usual breakfast of eggs, oatmeal, and black coffee, and when Lauren came into the kitchen with swollen eyes and a tense posture, I told her respectfully that since she had requested space and a defined timeline to evaluate whether I met her expectations, I would honor that framework. And to make it easier, I had moved my belongings into the guest room, so she could have a master bedroom without feeling crowded by my presence. I did not slam doors or dramatize the move. I simply relocated my clothes, my laptop, my gym bag, and a few personal items, leaving the rest of the house untouched, making it clear through action that I acknowledged her demand for space and structure. She looked unsettled by how methodical it all was, as if she had anticipated resistance or emotional pleading rather than compliance. By mid-morning, once I was at the office reviewing quarterly logistics forecasts and responding to emails about the Denver contracts, my phone began lighting up. She called repeatedly, and when I declined because I was in meetings, the text started flooding in, accusing me of being dramatic, of turning her request into some exaggerated power move, of intentionally distancing myself to make her feel guilty. I read them without reacting, replying only once to say that I was respecting the parameters she had established, and that if this was a formal evaluation period, then clarity and boundaries were necessary. Throughout the day, I maintained the same composure I would in any high-pressure corporate environment. Because to me, consistency is not something you perform selectively. It is who you are. I had lunch with a colleague after a strategy session, discussed expansion metrics, and stayed late to finalize a proposal draft, operating exactly as I would any other Tuesday. When I returned home that evening, the house smelled faintly of basil and tomato sauce, and soft music was playing in the background. The dining table was set with candles, wine glasses, and takeout containers from Bella Napoli arranged neatly on plates to look homemade, an attempt at romance that felt less spontaneous and more like a carefully timed countermove. Lauren was dressed in a way that suggested she expected reconciliation, her expression hopeful but tight, as though she was bracing for a specific reaction. She said she thought we could reset, that we could have dinner together and talk, her tone softer now, almost inviting me back into the emotional script she had envisioned. I looked at the table, then at her, and told her calmly that I had already eaten with a colleague after work because during an evaluation period I did not assume shared plans unless they were explicitly communicated. The words were not meant to wound, but they were factual. If our relationship was temporarily suspended into a performance review structure, then shared routines could not be presumed. I explained that I did not want to interfere with her process of assessing what she needed, and that I was simply adapting to the framework she had defined. I watched the realization settle over her face as the image she had constructed in her mind, where I would come home hungry for her approval and grateful for the symbolic gesture of candles and Italian takeout, quietly fractured. The romantic dinner was not about the food. It was about her expecting me to signal desperation, to show eagerness to reclaim my place. Instead, she saw a version of me that was steady, detached from theatrics, unwilling to oscillate between pleading and appeasing. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been, because it exposed that the dynamic she anticipated depended on my willingness to scramble for validation. And without that reaction, the narrative she had prepared had nowhere to go. By the second day, I realized that honoring her timeline, while still physically occupying the townhouse, blurred the boundaries she herself had demanded. So before sunrise, I booked a room at a Marriott downtown, packed a week's worth of clothes with the same efficiency I would prepare for a business trip, and left a brief note on the kitchen counter explaining that since she needed space to evaluate whether I was worthy of remaining in her life, I would remove my presence entirely so she could experience that clarity without the convenience of my daily contributions, cushioning the reality of what I brought to our partnership. I did not leave in anger or slam doors. I left deliberately, understanding that sometimes absence is the most accurate mirror. For 3.5 years, I had covered half the mortgage and utilities without hesitation, handled the leaking faucet in the upstairs bathroom, replaced the faulty garbage disposal myself instead of calling a plumber, assembled furniture, scheduled maintenance, and cooked dinner twice a week, even during peak work seasons, because I believed shared responsibility was part of adulthood, not leverage to be weaponized. I had been emotionally available whenever she needed to decompress after work, listening to office politics, family frustrations, insecurities she rarely admitted to anyone else, and I did it without tallying points because partnership, in my view, is built on consistent support rather than conditional transactions. Checking into that hotel was not about punishment. It was about clarity. If she needed to evaluate my value, then she needed to see what daily life looked like without the quiet infrastructure I maintained. I knew my phone was vibrating nonstop. The first call came from Madison, her best friend, her voice sharp and accusatory, insisting I had overreacted and that Lauren had only been trying to communicate her needs in a structured way. She told me that strong relationships require effort, and that walking out proved I was unwilling to fight. I listened without interrupting and then calmly repeated Lauren's exact words, word for word, about having 7 days to prove I was worthy of staying in her life and demonstrating I could prioritize her over my career to become the man she envisioned. There was a pause on the other end, a hesitation that stretched just long enough to signal discomfort before Madison pivoted to softer language about misunderstandings and stress. Not long after, Chloe, Lauren's younger sister, called with a tone that blended concern and defensiveness, saying her sister was hurting and that I needed to show empathy. Again, I did not argue. I repeated the same phrasing, emphasizing the 7-day deadline and the implication that my worth required formal demonstration. The silence that followed was heavier this time, punctuated by a subdued acknowledgement that maybe Lauren had chosen her words poorly. Later that afternoon, her mother called, attempting a more diplomatic approach, suggesting that ultimatums sometimes come from fear rather than malice, and that mature couples work through these phases. I respected her effort, but I recited the same statement once more, keeping my voice steady, explaining that I was not rejecting communication, but refusing to submit to a framework that resembled a probationary review rather than a mutual conversation. Each time I repeated Lauren's own language without embellishment or emotion, the reaction was the same, a long, uncomfortable silence that revealed an unspoken recognition of how controlling it sounded when stripped of romantic justification. None of them defended the wording directly after hearing it laid out plainly. None of them argued that 7 days to prove worth was a healthy standard. Instead, the conversations dissolved into vague reassurances that she did not mean it that way, that she was overwhelmed, that I should give her grace. Sitting in the quiet of the hotel room that evening, city lights reflecting against the window, I felt an unexpected calm. I had not attacked her character. I had not retaliated with cruelty, and I had not attempted to sway anyone with dramatics. I had simply held up her own words and allowed them to stand on their own. And in the silence that followed each repetition, it became clear that even the people closest to her could hear what I had heard that first night at the dining table. A tone not of partnership, but of evaluation, not of collaboration, but of conditional acceptance. Throughout the rest of the week, Lauren did not de-escalate. She intensified. As if the absence of the reaction she expected created a vacuum, she felt compelled to fill with bigger gestures and louder strategies. And the first sign of that came when she began posting carefully curated photos of us online, flattering shots from vacations in Charleston and Asheville, smiling selfies from rooftop bars, captions about partnership and growth that painted a narrative of stability and affection. Though controlling the public perception might pressure me into resuming the role she assumed I would instinctively reclaim. I noticed the tags and the comments from mutual friends about how perfect we looked together, and I did not engage, did not comment, did not react, because I understood that the performance was no longer for me, but for an audience that did not know there was a 7-day evaluation underway behind closed doors. 2 days later, she escalated again by showing up in the parking lot of Iron Forge Fitness right as I finished my morning session, Madison standing beside her like reinforcement, there. Expressions tense and expectant as I walked toward my car with my gym bag over my shoulder. The confrontation was clearly designed to corner me in a public setting where emotion would override composure, where I might feel compelled to defend myself loudly or reassure her dramatically. Lauren demanded to know why I was acting distant and robotic, why I was treating her like a colleague instead of a partner, and Madison interjected about pride and ego. I kept my voice even, told her calmly that she had established an evaluation period and that I was respecting it, that there were still several days remaining if she needed clarity, and that I did not believe public scenes contributed to thoughtful decisions. The lack of visible agitation on my end seemed to frustrate her more than any argument would have, because the script she anticipated required me to chase, not to stand still. Later that week, I went to a steakhouse in Uptown alone after a long day at the office, ordered a ribeye and a glass of red wine, and allowed myself the quiet of a solo dinner without negotiation or emotional tension. Halfway through my meal, she appeared at the entrance, eyes red, phone in hand, having tracked my location through the shared app we had never bothered to disable. She approached the table visibly shaken, accusing me of shutting her out, saying she hated how formal I was acting, how transactional and composed, how I was speaking to her like she was a client instead of the woman I claimed to love. I told her gently but firmly that clarity required consistency, that I would not oscillate between pleading and detachment, depending on the hour, and that she still had remaining days to complete the evaluation she had insisted on. I explained that I did not intend to interfere with her process, and that I was simply honoring the framework she had defined. Every time I responded that way, using her own structure as the reference point, her frustration deepened, because what she seemed to realize was that the power dynamic she expected, the one where I would scramble for her approval and negotiate for reassurance, was not materializing. Instead of destabilizing me, the ultimatum had forced me into steadiness, and that steadiness removed the leverage she anticipated. Her tears in that restaurant were real, but beneath them was something sharper, the recognition that control dissipates when the other person refuses to compete for validation. I paid my bill, stood up calmly, and told her once more that I respected her timeline, that the days were still hers to use, and walked out without raising my voice, understanding that composure in the face of escalation unsettles far more than confrontation ever could. By midweek, I made a deliberate decision to remove ego from the equation and book a session with a licensed therapist named Dr. Amanda Ruiz, because I needed an objective perspective to ensure I was not minimizing legitimate concerns or overreacting out of pride, and I refused to let either stubbornness or wounded confidence dictate how I interpreted what had happened. I explained the entire sequence to her in detail, from the moment I walked in after closing over $620,000 in contracts and was told I had 7 days to prove I was worthy, to my decision to comply with the framework rather than argue, to Lauren's escalating behavior once I stopped scrambling for approval. Dr. Ruiz listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes, her demeanor neutral and professional in a way that contrasted sharply with the emotional volatility of the past few days. When I finished, she leaned back slightly and explained in calm, measured language that ultimatums framed as time tests are classic emotional control tactics designed to create urgency and insecurity in the recipient, forcing them into a reactive state where they focus on proving value rather than evaluating the fairness of the demand itself. She clarified that healthy communication involves expressing fears, needs, and expectations directly, without imposing artificial deadlines that frame one partner as an applicant seeking validation. She pointed out that the 7-day structure shifted the dynamic from mutual discussion to hierarchical assessment, positioning Lauren as the evaluator and me as the candidate. According to her, the most telling indicator was not the ultimatum itself, but Lauren's panic once I stopped performing within the anticipated script. Dr. Ruiz explained that when someone introduces a timed test expecting visible distress, negotiation, or pleading, and instead receives calm detachment and boundary adherence, it disrupts the intended power exchange. She said Lauren's rapid escalation, the public confrontations, the narrative control on social media, the surprise appearances, and the emotional accusations about my formality all suggested an attempt to regain control once the leverage of urgency failed to produce the desired reaction. The therapist emphasized that genuine relationship concerns are usually accompanied by vulnerability and collaborative dialogue, not performance metrics or countdowns. She noted that my response, which was to honor the structure without submitting emotionally to it, effectively neutralized the urgency and exposed the imbalance inherent in the demand. As the conversation progressed, I mentioned something that had initially felt incidental but began to make sense in context: the engagement of Lauren's friend Natalie in Scottsdale a few weeks prior. I described how Natalie's proposal had been elaborate, complete with desert photos and a diamond that became the centerpiece of every group chat, and how since that trip Lauren had been subtly comparing timelines, making comments about age and milestones, questioning where we stood without ever explicitly saying she was anxious about marriage. Dr. Ruiz nodded and explained that comparison-based pressure often manifests indirectly, especially when someone feels behind their peers but does not articulate that insecurity openly. Instead of saying she was afraid of falling behind, Lauren may have reframed that anxiety into a test of my commitment, attempting to accelerate reassurance through control rather than conversation. Hearing it articulated that way reframed the entire week. It was not about my work schedule or missed dinners. It was about an internal clock she had started measuring against someone else's engagement ring. Rather than directly communicating fear or desire, she had constructed a timed evaluation to force visible proof of prioritization, hoping urgency would compel dramatic gestures. Dr. Ruiz concluded by saying that the calm consistency I had maintained was not avoidance, but boundary enforcement, and that the discomfort Lauren was experiencing likely stemmed from realizing that control cannot substitute for honest dialogue. I left that session grounded, not vindicated, but clear that the issue had never been a lack of love or effort on my part. It had been a lack of transparent communication on hers, masked as an ultimatum. On the 7th day, we agreed to meet at a neutral coffee shop in South End, a place neither of us associated with shared memories, and I arrived early, ordered a black coffee, and chose a table near the window where the afternoon light made everything feel almost deceptively calm. When Lauren walked in, I could immediately tell she had rehearsed what she was about to say. Her posture was composed, her expression softened into vulnerability, and when she sat down across from me, she took a steady breath before beginning what sounded like a carefully structured apology. She admitted that seeing Natalie's proposal in Scottsdale had unsettled her more than she wanted to admit, that watching someone in her immediate circle step into engagement had triggered insecurities about timing, about age, about whether she was falling behind some invisible schedule she had constructed for herself. She said she panicked and believed that forcing a deadline would create urgency, that it would push me toward commitment faster, that if she made me fear losing her, I would respond by accelerating the future she wanted. She said she chose me, that she realized she had handled it poorly, that she wanted to fix everything and move forward without tests or ultimatums. Her voice trembled at certain points, and for the first time all week she spoke directly about fear rather than expectations. I listened without interrupting, letting her finish completely before I reached into my bag and pulled out a simple folder I had prepared. Inside was a documented timeline of the week, not dramatic screenshots or emotional commentary, just dates and brief summaries of events. Day 1, ultimatum issued with 7-day deadline. Day 2, repeated calls and accusations of dramatics once I complied. Day 3, public confrontation at the gym parking lot with Madison present. Day 4, unannounced appearance at a restaurant after tracking my location. Day 5, social media narrative posts portraying stability while privately escalating pressure. Each entry was factual, stripped of emotion, reflecting the pattern rather than the heat of individual moments. I explained calmly that what concerned me was not her insecurity about Natalie's engagement, because insecurity is human and understandable, but the method she chose to manage it. Instead of communicating fear directly, she constructed a timed evaluation that positioned my worth as conditional. I told her that while she was evaluating whether I was worthy of remaining in her life, I had been evaluating whether I wanted to be with someone who frames love as something that can be tested under a countdown clock. I said that her panic once I stopped performing, once I honored her own structure without scrambling for approval, revealed that the deadline was never about clarity, but about leverage. Each time she attempted to override her own rules, whether by staging romance, orchestrating public confrontations, or recruiting others to intervene, it demonstrated that the test was not sustainable unless I reacted with visible desperation. I told her that partnership requires mutual security, not artificial urgency, and that commitment built under pressure is fragile because it stems from fear rather than alignment. I acknowledged that her apology was sincere, that I did not doubt her feelings for me, but I also explained that trust erodes when someone is willing to destabilize the foundation of a relationship to accelerate reassurance. I said that I could not stay in a dynamic where, during moments of comparison or anxiety, I might once again be placed on trial to prove my value within a fixed time frame. I had worked too deliberately to build a stable life, to accept a relationship where my position could become conditional whenever external pressures resurfaced. When I finished, there was no anger in my voice, only finality. I told her that I wished her clarity and growth, that I hoped she would learn to voice her fears directly rather than disguising them as ultimatums, but that I would not remain in a relationship where I had to periodically demonstrate worth to maintain my place. I stood up, left money on the table for my coffee, and walked out knowing that sometimes the most decisive act of love for oneself is refusing to participate in a dynamic that reduces partnership to a recurring evaluation. Within 2 weeks of that final conversation in South End, I signed a lease on a one-bedroom apartment overlooking Freedom Park, a space with wide windows that let in morning light and enough quiet to feel like a reset rather than an escape. In the act of arranging my furniture, organizing my books, and setting up my desk exactly how I wanted, it felt less like starting over and more like reclaiming simplicity after unnecessary complexity. I finalized the senior regional director promotion at Blue Peak Solutions without hesitation, stepping fully into the role I had earned through years of discipline, long nights, and consistent performance. And instead of feeling guilty for prioritizing my career, I felt aligned, because ambition was never the enemy of partnership. It was only incompatible with someone who viewed it as competition. Untangling our joint accounts was handled with the same clarity that defined the week of the ultimatum. We divided shared savings according to documented contributions, canceled the shared utilities, removed each other from emergency contacts, and closed the chapter without theatrics. There were no explosive arguments over money, no attempts to blur financial boundaries, just clean separation and final signatures. The townhouse eventually went on the market, and with each practical step completed, I felt lighter, not because I had won something, but because I no longer had to defend my right to exist as I was. Months later, at a networking event hosted by the Charlotte Chamber of Commerce, I met Emily Harper. She introduced herself with direct eye contact and a firm handshake, asked thoughtful questions about logistics expansion strategies rather than my job title alone, and spoke about her own work in sustainable real estate development with clarity and confidence. There was no undercurrent of evaluation in her tone, no subtle probing to measure whether I fit an invisible checklist. When she learned about my promotion, she did not test it against her timeline or question whether it would interfere with her expectations. She simply acknowledged the effort it must have taken and said she respected consistency. What struck me most was what had not happened. She never asked me to prove my worth, never hinted that my value depended on accelerated milestones, never framed affection as contingent upon performance. Our conversations unfolded naturally, built on curiosity rather than comparison. When we disagreed on minor things, the discussion remained collaborative rather than competitive. There was no urgency manufactured to force reassurance, no deadlines imposed to manufacture commitment. The stability felt unfamiliar at first, not because it was dull, but because it was grounded. It was partnership without leverage. Looking back, the real lesson of Lauren's 7-day test was not about ultimatums or even about insecurity triggered by someone else's engagement. It was about how quickly truth surfaces when pressure is met with calm consistency. It took only one steady refusal to compete for validation to reveal the underlying dynamic. When I stopped performing for approval and simply upheld my boundaries, the imbalance became obvious. Love built on partnership does not require countdown clocks, and it does not need one person to destabilize themselves to reassure the other. It thrives when both people recognize value without demanding proof. standing on my new balcony overlooking Freedom Park months later. Promotion finalized, finances untangled, life streamlined. I understood that the 7-day test had unintentionally clarified something far more important than commitment timelines. It exposed the difference between someone who sees love as collaboration and someone who sees it as leverage. And once that distinction becomes clear, the only real decision left is whether to remain in the arena of evaluation or step into something steadier, where worth is recognized rather than negotiated.